In the quiet hours before dawn, when engines thundered across foreign skies and diplomacy balanced on the edge of a spinning propeller blade, a secret gamble unfolded, one that united two uneasy allies in the most unlikely way. This is the story of American bombers landing deep inside the Soviet Union, conducting shuttle missions so dangerous, so politically fragile, that history nearly erased them. But today we bring them back. Hello and welcome to the channel. Today, we journey into the forgotten world of Operation Frantic, the US-USSR shuttle bombing missions of World War II. Missions hidden behind steel doors, mistrust, and the burning hope that cooperation might end the war faster. Our story begins not on a battlefield, but inside smoke-filled briefing rooms, where strategists imagined the impossible, American planes taking off from Britain or Italy, striking Germany, and landing safely in Soviet-controlled territory. No one had attempted such a thing before. And yet, by 1944, the war demanded boldness. Inside the dim interior of an Allied planning headquarters, men in uniforms traced long red lines across giant maps. These lines stretched from the air bases of England, curved into the smoky heart of the Reich, and continued eastward toward Poltava, Mirgorod, and Peryatyn, three Soviet bases chosen to house American aircrews. From the exterior, these plans seemed diplomatic brilliance, a display of unity between Roosevelt and Stalin. But inside, officers knew there were layers of mistrust, secrecy, and political tension. Still, the strategy was simple on paper: shuttle bombing. Hit Germany from the west, land in the east, rearm, and strike again, a hammer from both directions. As American crews trained for these missions, excitement mixed with unease. Many had never imagined landing in the Soviet Union. Rumors spread through hangars, stories about strict Soviet guards, about strange aircraft markings, about distrustful commanders. But what mattered to the airmen was the mission: reduce German fuel production, destroy aircraft factories, and break enemy morale by proving Allied bombers could strike from anywhere. When the first missions were finally approved, preparations moved swiftly. Bombers were painted, engines tuned, and crew briefings delivered with a seriousness that no one forgot. Inside the cockpits, pilots felt the weight of history pressing on them. They would not only fight, they would represent their nations in a fragile political theater. The route was long, stretching across Europe's most heavily defended airspace. But from the outside, when the formations lifted into the sky, they looked unstoppable, thousands of horsepower rising into the cold blue. German radar stations soon detected them, but the speed and scale overwhelmed defenses. Their first targets were rail yards and industrial centers deep inside Nazi-occupied territory. Bomb doors opened, payloads dropped, explosions rippled across the ground. Yet perhaps the most breathtaking moment came after the attack, when the bombers turned not toward their usual bases, but toward the mysterious east. As they flew across the front line, some crew members pressed their faces against the glass to see Soviet trenches below. The Red Army soldiers pointing up at the American planes were witnessing history too. When the bombers finally descended over the vast Ukrainian fields and approached Poltava, everything felt surreal. The exterior of the base looked rough: dirt runways, hastily constructed wooden structures, and Soviet soldiers lining the perimeter with weapons ready. But inside the camp, American ground crews marveled at the hospitality of Soviet mechanics and officers, who greeted them with cautious smiles. Despite cultural gaps and language barriers, there was warmth: shared cigarettes, exchanged patches, and toasts with strong vodka that burned hotter than aviation fuel. Operation Frantic had begun with promise. Days later, rearming operations started. Inside the makeshift Soviet hangars, American and Soviet mechanics worked shoulder to shoulder. Tools clanked, engines roared, and translators rushed to keep communication alive. Yet beneath the cooperation, tension simmered. Some Soviet officers monitored every movement, suspicious of American cameras or notes. The Americans, meanwhile, struggled with strict rules, such as no wandering outside assigned zones. Inside the mess tents, crews discussed their impressions, friendly faces but constant watchfulness. Still, morale stayed high. They were a bridge between nations that rarely trusted each other. Their next mission struck German oil fields. Once again, bombers thundered into the sky, this time taking off from Soviet ground. The Soviets watched with pride. After all, the Allied bombing power was using their airspace to crush Germany's industrial nerves. The flight to the target was long and exhausting, and inside the planes the heat grew unbearable as flak bursts hammered the formations. But the attacks were successful. Smoke rose from burning fuel depots, black plumes twisting like dying serpents. Yet everything changed on the night of June 21, 1944. Under a moonlit sky, German aircraft launched a surprise raid against Poltava. The exterior of the base looked peaceful at first. Silent planes lined up, guards pacing quietly. Then came the distant hum. It grew louder until the night exploded in fire. Bombs dropped like red stars falling from the heavens. Hangars burst apart. Flames raced across fuel pits. Inside bunkers, American crews huddled together, the ground shaking beneath them. Dozens of B-17s were destroyed on the ground, charred metal glowing in the inferno. The Soviets scrambled anti-aircraft fire, but coordination was poor. The Luftwaffe turned Poltava into a graveyard of burning wings. By dawn, smoke blanketed the area. The destruction shocked both allies. American commanders demanded answers, blaming the Soviets for failing to protect the base. The Soviets, insulted, insisted they had done all they could. Diplomats struggled to calm the storm. Inside the temporary headquarters, generals argued while translators tried to keep tempers from igniting. Operation Frantic, once a symbol of unity, was now trembling. Still, the missions continued. The shuttle strategy was too valuable to abandon. Exterior repairs began immediately. Wrecked aircraft removed, new shelters built, defensive measures increased. Inside the barracks, airmen mourned lost comrades and wrote letters home describing the terrifying night. Morale dipped, but duty remained. In later missions, bombers hit German airfields, tank factories, and transportation hubs. The missions were effective, but dangerously unpredictable. Weather shifted quickly over Eastern Europe, and communication between Soviet and American command was often slow. Pilots complained that Soviet air controllers gave last-minute instructions or none at all. There were moments of deep cultural misunderstanding. A salute done incorrectly, a photograph taken at the wrong moment, a request denied with no explanation. Yet there were also bright memories. American gunners sharing chocolate with Soviet children near the bases. Soviet mechanics teaching American pilots Russian swear words. Moments where war briefly stepped aside for friendship. These human connections kept spirits alive, even when political tensions grew heavy. But politics was a shadow that never left. Inside Stalin's high command, some officers worried that American presence might expose Soviet military secrets. There were areas Americans were forbidden to enter, buildings they could not photograph, questions they could not ask. For the U.S. Army Air Forces, the lack of transparency created constant challenges. Exterior cooperation looked smooth to the world, but inside both governments, distrust spread quietly. By late 1944, Operation Frantic's value began to fade. The Soviet advance pushed deeply into Eastern Europe, making the shuttle bases less strategically positioned. The Luftwaffe's ability to strike Poltava again remained a constant fear, and diplomacy between Washington and Moscow grew colder as conversations about post-war Europe created new fault lines. The Americans wanted continued military partnership. The Soviets wanted control over everything in their territory. Inside Allied meeting rooms, planners debated whether the risks were still worth it. The final missions of Operation Frantic were smaller and less dramatic, Bombers targeted rail lines and retreating German forces. Soviet cooperation continued, but enthusiasm was gone. Many American crews longed to return to Italy or Britain, where operations were more predictable and bases felt safer. When the last shuttle mission ended, there was no grand ceremony, no speeches. The planes simply stopped coming. The bases went quiet. In the exterior world of global politics, the end of Operation Frantic barely registered. The world's attention shifted to Normandy, to the Pacific, to the final collapse of Nazi Germany. Inside the memories of those who flew and served, however, the operation remained unforgettable, a strange mixture of bravery, diplomacy, disaster, and hope. They remembered the rough Ukrainian airfields, the shared laughter over meals with Soviet officers, the terror of the Poltava raid, and the feeling of landing in a land that was both ally and unknown. After the war, the Soviet Union restricted access to records about the missions. For decades, Operation Frantic was obscured, rarely mentioned in major histories. Veterans passed away, their stories fading with them. The world forgot that for a brief moment, American bombers and Soviet bases formed a bridge across hatred, ideology, and oceans. It was imperfect cooperation, full of suspicion, but also proof that, when necessary, nations could fight together for a greater cause. Today, when we look back, the story feels like a window into a world where two superpowers, soon to become rivals in the Cold War, trusted each other just enough to share runways, ammunition, and risk. The operation stands as a reminder that alliances are complicated, that cooperation is never simple, and that the human stories of war often lie buried beneath politics. The legacy of Operation Frantic is not just the destroyed bombers at Poltava or the successful strikes on German industry. It is the courage of aircrews who flew into the unknown, the determination of mechanics who repaired aircraft under impossible conditions, and the fragile handshake between two nations whose partnership was always one spark away from collapse. It was a bold experiment, a dangerous undertaking, and a forgotten chapter of World War II deserving of remembrance. And so, as we close this narrative, we honor the men who flew those missions, the ones who never returned, and the ones who lived to tell stories that history nearly silenced. Operation Frantic may have been overshadowed, but today, its memory takes flight once more.